Hello and welcome to this video where we will go through the solutions to exercise 4.4 on the Herfindahl-Hirschmann-Index, or for short HHI. This exercise is part of our course on competition policy and strategy, and this exercise is the final exercise on our fourth assignment. Alright, as you know from the lecture, the HHI is a measure of market concentration. So it is supposed to help us understand whether or not a market is concentrated or not. We want to discuss the HHI, how to calculate it, what it measures, and its pros and cons, basically based on this exercise. In this exercise, we are asked to consider a market for a homogeneous good. We also know the demand function, which reads quantity of price equals 600 minus P. And we are once more assuming that there is a duopoly, so there is two producers that are facing a Cournot competition. All right. We furthermore assume that both firms incur the same constant marginal costs of production, which is C equals 300. All right. Now in the first exercise, or first task of this exercise, we are asked to find the equilibrium, the market equilibrium in this setting, and then calculate the HHI. Finally, we are then asked to determine the consumer surplus in this market equilibrium. Now, finding the market equilibrium in a symmetric Cournot duopoly, of course, is something we already know and already did several times by now. So let's just very quickly go through the solutions. The first part is, of course, to find the profit functions of both firms in the market. We then find the market equilibrium by finding the profit maximizing quantity of both firms. How do we find the profit maximizing quantity of both firms? Well, we state the profit maximization problem for both firms. We then maximize the profit function of both firms, state the first order conditions, and then by solving this equation system where we have two profit maximizing conditions for one for each firm, we can then find out that the market equilibrium in the market equilibrium, both firms produce the same exact quantity of 100. Okay? Now, knowing the equilibrium quantity of both firms of each 100 or 200 in total, we can then calculate the equilibrium price of 400. Knowing the price and the quantity, we can then calculate that both firms will make profits of 10,000 and that the consumer surplus in this market will be 20,000. All right. So far so good, and so far nothing new. Now to the new part. We are also asked to calculate the HHI. In this case, where both firms are symmetric, it is quite easy to see that their respective market share, SI, takes a value of 50% for both firms. Right? Both firms serve 50% of the market because they are symmetric. We wouldn't even have to calculate the market equilibrium to know this, right? Two symmetric firms, so both firms serve 50% of the market. Now, in order to calculate the HHI, of course, we need to know how this index is defined. And this index is defined as simply the sum of the squared market shares. And throughout this semester, throughout this lecture series, this whole course, we will consider the market share written in percent. So what is written in this sum is the sum of 50 squared. All right, 50 squared, then 2,500. 2 times 2,500 yields a Herfindahl-Hirschmann-Index of 5,000 in this scenario. Okay. Let's now introduce a change. Let's now introduce an innovation. Both firms, firm 1 per assumption has now new marginal costs that are reduced. It's only 150 in contrast to the old marginal costs of 300 in the initial setting. All right. So in task B, one firm, from 1 to be precise, has lower marginal costs of 150. We are now asked to again calculate the HHI for this new situation, and we are once more asked to calculate the consumer surplus. All right, so of course, in order to find out the market share, we need, in order to find out the HHI, we need to know the market share of both firms, right? If we want to find out the market share of both firms, we need to know the quantities both firms will produce in market equilibrium. All this just to say we need to find the market equilibrium in the first step. Okay? And that is what we are doing. Once more, this is finding a market equilibrium in a Cournot competition. This time, however, it is of course an asymmetric scenario. Both firms are facing different marginal costs. The procedure, however, is of course exactly the same. We start with the profit function of each firm. We state the profit maximization problem. We find out that there is two conditions for the profit maximum for the firms, one condition for each firm, which are named in these two rows. And by solving this equation function, by solving this equation system where we have two equations and two variables, Q1 and Q2, we can then find out that in equilibrium, the profit maximizing quantities are 200 for firm 1 and 50 for firm 2. So there is a total quantity of 250 in the market. The equilibrium then, of course, is characterized by a total quantity of 250, which comes with a price of 350, and then knowing the quantity of firm 1 and the price in the market, we can calculate that the profits of firm 1 are 40,000. Knowing the quantity of firm 2 and the price in the market, we can calculate that the profit of firm 2 is 2,500. And of course, knowing the total quantity in the market and the price in equilibrium in the market, we can calculate the consumer surplus, which is 31,250. We now know the market equilibrium, we know the quantity of both firms, and we know the consumer surplus. What we still need to calculate is the HHI. And similarly to what we just did, we of course have to calculate the sum of the squared market shares. And the market share can be derived from the equilibrium quantities both firms are producing in this situation. If the total quantity is 250 and one firm is producing 200 of this of course is a market share of 80. The second firm is producing 50 out of 250, which of course is equivalent to a market share of 20%. So the HHI, following the same formula which we used on the previous slide, then yields 6,800. Okay, and with this we have answered all the questions in task B. Let's now move on to task C. And in task C, we are then asked to argue whether the approach of looking at the HHI would yield a meaningful result in the case described, right? So we are faced with the statement that the HHI is often used to measure the intensity of competition in a market. And now, based on what we just calculated and what we just analyzed, we are asked to evaluate this. Now, intuitively, intense competition is equivalent, or intense competition would yield or would result in a situation where firms have similar market shares. So when there is similar market shares, there is a low concentration of the firms in the market, and we should see a low Herfindahl-Hirschmann-Index as well. Okay, so what we have come to learn, what we have come to understood is low HHI should be something good, something that we should aim for, right? Low HHI means intense competition. Intense competition means high allocative efficiency, right? However, what we have just seen in tasks A and B of this exercise is that an innovation resulted in an increase of the HHI. Okay, so what we have seen is that due to this innovation, this reduction in marginal costs, the competition intensity in the market decreased. Now, how do we interpret this? A decreased competition intensity is, of course, something we would consider non-desirable in the sense of interpreting the HHI. All right. At the same time, what we have seen is that the consumer surplus increased from 20,000 to 31,250. Okay, so this HHI is not taking the effects of this dynamic efficiency, this reduction in costs, into consideration at all. So HHI does not incorporate dynamic efficiency. Furthermore, this innovation might, after all, come from or might be promoted by competition. So the baseline competition might be what was the driver for this innovation. And then there's one final issue with the HHI, and that is that HHI does not take collusion into account. Now, this is this might be quite abstract for the moment because we have not talked about collusion yet at all. This will be topic in the future assignments. But basically what I can already tell you, and again, we will discuss this in detail in future assignments, so don't be too confused at this moment. But what we know is, or what we can know is that collusion is more likely in markets where firms are of similar size. So collusion would actually be more likely in the first setting where both firms are of equal size, right? After innovation and after this cost reduction, firms are unequal, and then ceteris paribus, we would conclude that collusive behavior is less likely. And of course, bottom line, collusive behavior is something not desirable from a welfare perspective.